Well, welcome everybody, and I'm Jamie Dernan, and I want to thank you all for joining us and saying happy birthday to Andy Marshall. Before we start, a special thanks to Stephanie Papa, Lily Dernan, Abigail McDonough, and all the other people who have been so helpful in getting us here today, and also just driving Andy's legacy. And so thank you. Quick ground rules, and I guess it's a rule. All the speakers today are going to be speaking in a personal capacity, and our remarks, unless otherwise approved in advance in writing by the speaker, are our remarks and not those of our employers or anybody else. So if anyone wonders about the continuing contribution Andy's making to the future of national security, you just have to look at the numbers. At today's event, we probably have more people than the several hundred who attended Andy's memorial service in person. And so, again, thank you for joining, and I appreciate it. So some of you actually may be unfamiliar with Andy Marshall. His career as a national security strategist actually spanned over 7 decades, including over 25 years at the RAND Corporation and 40 years as a director of net assessment. During this time, the people that Andy collaborated with, which included folks like, I'm sorry, let me start over. So during this time, those he collaborated with, those new voices he found, articulated new methods of analyzing the character of long-term competitions and future wars. And this allowed us to understand the reality of the Soviet Union. It was Andy's focus on people, new people, and the analysis of trends that led to his caution about the growth of Asia led by China, and also his belief in the early 1980s that the character of warfare was changing, that information could be the dominant domain of warfare in the 21st century. But for those of you who know Andy, you know that he was much more than his career. Most of all, to many of us, he was a friend. He was a man who loved his 2 wives, Mary and Anne, both who predeceased him. And he was also a man who knew when to be serious, when to tell jokes, and just have fun. I actually think that would be the more interesting book about Andy if we could find somebody to write it. Very few of us knew Andy when he was a new voice with the folks like Herman Kahn, Dick Nelson, the Wohlstetters, Roberta and Albert, Nathan Leitis, Jim Schlesinger, Sid Winter, and a lot more at the RAND Corporation. But because of them, and it's always because of them, and Andy was always very clear about that it wasn't just him, it was the group and these new voices. They brought a lot of passion to the discussion and articulation of new ways to think about the Soviet Union. In fact, I think today, in my view, you're going to hear from those folks who continue to be new voices. So today, Dr. Jackie Deal is going to join us as the moderator. Jackie's the president of the Long-Term Strategy Group. She started working for Andy as a consultant in the early aughts, as she likes to say, when she was writing her dissertation on ancient Chinese military classics. She co-teaches courses on diagnostic net assessment through the American Academy for Strategic Education, AASE, pronounced ACE. So Jackie's going to start by offering her thoughts on Andy's life and legacy, and then is going to moderate a question and answer session with our speakers, Dr. Richard Danzig, who's also going to offer the opening remarks here, Dr. Andrew May, and Dr. Matt Daniels. Now it's my pleasure to introduce somebody who, as Stephanie and others, and including me, will tell you, needs no introduction. Dr. Richard Danzig, the 71st Secretary of the Navy, Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins Applied University Physics Laboratory, and he also served as the Undersecretary of the Navy. And from 2007 and 2008, he was a senior advisor, then Senator Barack Obama. So we're pleased to have Richard here today, and he's also as a speaker and advisor. And Richard, over to you. Thank you.
I'm delighted to do this, Andy. Jamie, thank you so much for that nice introduction. We're getting there. Can you hear me now, Jamie? Okay. Thank you so much for this nice introduction. I'm delighted and honored to do this. Andy Marshall can be celebrated for so many things, and the natural tendency is to gravitate towards his really very substantial qualities of mind and of achievement. He was a remarkably smart man. He had rock hard integrity. Jamie has already referred to some of the things that he accomplished, which are so substantial. His longevity, the 40 years in office itself, was so unusual that it bears comment and amplified his power and his contribution. But I'd like to actually talk about none of these and hope that other speakers will focus on them. What I want to focus on is something different, which I think underlay the kind of joy so many of us felt in Andy, and really explains in some respect this unusual event. How many people in recent Pentagon history do we celebrate the 100th birthday of? And I think the fundamental characteristic comes back to the fact that Andy loved us and we loved him. And I recognize that in the Pentagon, the word love is not frequently used about officials. In fact, though many four-letter words are common in that five-sided building in describing people, love is not one of them. But Andy had this extraordinary quality. He gave each of us a sense that we were important, that he cared about what we thought, that he wanted to give us space, unlike many people with large egos who occupy many of these kinds of jobs. He didn't fill the space. He centered it around us and emptied it for us and empowered us. And I think we responded to that love by giving him our own, as well as giving him our best intellectually and conceptually. I think one reason that this is not a Pentagon characteristic, as Andy manifested also, is that the way he did it was not in a macho kind of love. Nobody ever got a bear hug from Andy Marshall. He never slapped you on the back. These things are almost impossible to envision. His style was more, dare I say it, maternal. He cared about featuring us and bringing out the best in us and making us feel that we had something significant to contribute. And that's an extraordinary thing, and an extraordinary lesson, I think, for the rest of us in leadership, in how one accomplishes things. It elicits also in us, I think, the feelings that you see today. We want to celebrate Andy. As Secretary of the Navy, I had great powers, at least in theory, to do a number of things. I think one of the things that gave me the most delight, that I think of with the most pleasure in terms of recalling being able to do something good, was enlisting a bugler to go down to Andy's office to play for him on his birthday. He was a man you wanted to do things for. And I think that that love is manifested by so many people who are participants here, people who've given extraordinarily to Andy as he gave to them, as for example, Melissa Hathaway and Jerry Warner and Jamie. That explains in some ways why we've all come together today. We're members, in effect, of a big family, and we are connected in that way to each other. So as we celebrate Andy's very real achievements of a cognitive sort, I'd like to underscore this one of an emotional sort. It brings us all together. He really loved us, and to this very moment, we really love him. Over to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Richard, for those moving remarks. And thank you to the Andrew W. Marshall Foundation for the opportunity to speak today. The centennial of Mr. Marshall's birth offers us an occasion to look back, to look forward, as he so often urged us to do. Even without the benefit of his 97 years, we can still learn, I think, from considering a few of his formative early experiences and how they may have shaped his approach to defense-related research and analysis. Mr. Marshall was unusual not just because of his longevity, but also because of his curiosity, the knowledge he acquired through practical work, and the perspective that this gave him on current events. In a word, he did not assume things that many academic strategists may take for granted today. He also had great pride in what his country had accomplished over his lifetime and the way that the United States contributed to the Allied triumph in World War II and the Cold War to become a leading global power. Consider that Mr. Marshall was born during the post-World War I recession, and by the end of his first decade, he and his family were suffering through the Great Depression. It was not clear when or if the United States would return to prosperity. And as Andy's second decade and high school career ended, another global war was clearly beginning. He went to work at an auto body factory that was converted to make aircraft wings and other parts. In other words, he didn't take for granted the existence of aircraft or the requirements for their production. He understood from firsthand experience what complex, impressive machines they were. And I think he later brought this sensibility to his analysis of the air balance between the United States and the Soviet Union. Later, he worked at the University of Chicago with Enrico Fermi on Fermi's cyclotron magnet. So he also knew firsthand the complexity of the machines required to accelerate atomic particles, along with the awesome destructive power of atomic weapons, having witnessed an early nuclear test. In addition to his unusual technical understanding, Mr. Marshall brought to his work an intense interest in or openness to the variety and diversity of human social, political, economic, and military arrangements or patterns. He often credited his early reading of Alfred Toynbee's History of the World and the range of colleagues he encountered at that aircraft factory, younger and older, men and women, native-born Americans and immigrants. But he continued to feed his curiosity for the rest of his career, this curiosity about the variety of human nature. When I met him in the early 2000s, he recommended an article that had appeared in the journal Science in February 1967 on different ways that students from different countries learned science. And in particular, he remembered that in the article, it was described that school children in Nepal and Hawaii had been asked to draw a map describing their route from home to school. And there was tremendous variation between those two subject pools in the way the maps were drawn. I think he found this fascinating because it showed how what is in people's heads as a product of their upbringing or their culture, their social background, can affect the way they interact then with physical reality, something as concrete as the distance and the terrain between their homes and their schools, routes they take every day. They had different ways of interpreting or representing physical reality. He thought this was important. In other words, he proceeded inductively to try to understand the competitions the United States faced and the approaches and perspectives of our interlocutors, whether friends and allies or competitors. He didn't start with the assumption that they see the world exactly as we do. He was interested in the big picture, of course, particularly in opportunities for the United States to compete better. But his diagnosis started with empirics or data about what was happening, and to the best he could understand why. Why were our competitors conducting themselves in ways that surprised us or deviated from our example? Why weren't they more like us? What historical, geographic, cultural, economic, bureaucratic, social, or political factors were shaping their behavior? As this list suggests, he was open to a variety of potential explanations. Though he was formally trained as a statistician, he didn't have one methodology that he applied to all questions. On the contrary, even in his 98th year, he was surrounded by books and journals on history, religion, demography, anthropological accounts of other cultures, physics, of course, statistics. I learned this the hard way because as a newly minted DPhil from the University of Oxford, I once made the mistake of going to meet with him and saying, "Mr. Marshall, I think I figured it out. With all the enthusiasm a recent graduate from a politics and international relations faculty could muster, I think I figured it out. You are interested in constructivism, but really you're a defensive neo-realist, I said. And he just looked at me and he shook his head, he chuckled. I think he was showing a lot of forbearance. He said, I'm not a theory person, I'm a reality person. In his honor, then, let us all try to expand our horizons, our intellectual flexibility, pursuit of new evidence, curiosity about the variety of perspectives and approaches to strategy that our allies and partners, as well as our competitors, may adopt. And one more thing, clearly Mr. Marshall had a very healthy appreciation of all the variables one had to consider to make an accurate diagnosis. He understood uncertainty, but he nonetheless believed in the possibility of devising and executing strategy. So let's carry that work forward. It's the least we can do for Mr. Marshall and the great country for which he worked so long and so hard. And with that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers for today. First, Dr. May, Andrew May, will look back at Andy's life and his influences. Dr. May has written the history of the RAND Corporation, and he worked for Andy Marshall for nearly 20 years during Mr. Marshall's time as Director of Net Assessment. And after that, Dr. Matthew Daniels will look forward at how we can channel Mr. Marshall's ways for the future. Matthew's work focuses on US space programs and artificial intelligence. He came to work for Mr. Marshall from NASA, and before that, he used to fly out for strategy seminars hosted by Mr. Marshall while he was finishing his dissertation at Stanford. We're going to close with a Q&A session with you, the audience. So please feel free to type your questions in Zoom's Q&A box or the feature at the bottom of your screen. For now, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Jackie, and thanks again to the Foundation for giving me this opportunity to talk a little bit about Andy. Before I get started, let me just put out a disclaimer. I'm not here on behalf of the Defense Department. I'm here on my own time. These are just my own, of course, my own views about Mr. Marshall and his life. I'm going to talk mostly about Mr. Marshall's time at RAND in the 1940s and the 1950s. I'm going to do this in part because it was a time of his life that tends to get skipped over when people talk about him, because his tenure as Director of Net Assessment was so incredible, as Rich Danzig commented on, and so long. People often forget that there was 25 years at RAND before that, and so it deserves a little bit more weight than it gets. It was also a time that Andy himself returned to a lot over the last couple of years of his life, and talked to not just me, but to Jackie and Jamie and many other people about that time. And so there's maybe something special weight there. And last, I kind of like this because it suggests that institutions matter, that places like RAND matter, as Jamie and Jackie commented, and that maybe we don't have to wait for God to give us another Andy Marshall, fully formed, a complete strategist, but that we can, as a country, try to develop more people. Well, we might not get another Andy Marshall, but there are things that can be done to try to cultivate people to think in the kinds of ways that Andy Marshall thought. I could talk a lot. I have talked a lot about how RAND in the 1950s worked and what a wonderful place it was. Here, I'll just say it was an incredibly vibrant environment, intellectually and in every other way. California in the 1940s and 1950s was a very, very pleasant place to be. And RAND was an extraordinary place of exceptional people and marvelous new ideas and new methodologies and technological innovations of all kinds. And it's hard to distill out of that specific things that influenced Andy more than others, but I'm going to focus on three people here who I think had a special effect: Charlie Hitch, Joe Loftus, and Herman Kahn. Charlie Hitch was an economist and an academic star who was recruited to join RAND and head their economics department. After leaving RAND, he joined the Kennedy administration as a senior defense official, and then went on to be the head of the University of California system as chancellor, and had a long and storied career. From Hitch, I think what Andy really learned about was management and leadership, and most of all about how to lead other analysts. Hitch had, as I said, been the head of the economics department, and he was the one who really built that department. And Andy had started in social sciences, and Hitch recruited him first half-time and then full-time to become an economist there. And it was under Hitch's tutelage that Andy really did the work that we think about when we think about Andy Marshall. He worked on questions about warfare and strategies in warfare and long-term competition, and the first order types of questions about what high-end conflict is really about. But he also learned from Hitch, as I mentioned, how to be a leader. And most of all, I think what Hitch was a very indirect sort of leader. He would tend to lead other analysts by pushing them or encouraging them or shifting their work a little bit in one direction or another. And most of all, Hitch did this through his own work. He himself was an analyst, and he wrote in a very balanced, even-handed way, and wrote in a very low-key style, even when he was addressing questions of tremendous national significance or incredible emotional weight, like thermonuclear war or the future of this country. And I think tried in that way to encourage the analysts who worked in the economics department to take a similar kind of approach. Joe Loftus was a different sort of case. He was an Air Force intelligence analyst who worked for the Air Force, or for the Army Air Forces during the war, and for the Air Force after the war, largely on questions of targeting selection and strategies for a prospective nuclear war. It's hard to describe the influence that Loftus had on Marshall and his thinking, but it was Loftus more than anybody that Andy talked to me about in the final couple of years of his life. So I feel I ought to give it a try, and I'll do the best I can here. Loftus and Andy worked together in the mid-1950s for a space of 4 or 5 years, quite intensively. And what they worked on was trying to understand the future of the Soviet force posture, the kinds of forces the Soviet Union was likely to build. And at the time, the prevailing notion was that's impossible. The Soviet Union is led by one, or with the most, of very few people, and they can decide to do whatever they want. And what Loftus and Marshall found was that wasn't true at all, that the Soviet Union was made up, the Soviet military was made up of large organizations, that any one year's decisions were largely the consequence of decisions that had been made in the years past, that these organizations and institutions had their own preferences and needed to be consulted like constituencies in any large organization. And so they found that if you wanted to understand the future, you needed to study the past. And then in addition to understanding the trajectory that forces might take, you could begin to understand how decisions had been made. And you might also begin, if you understood those things, to see what your competitors' priorities had been in the past. And maybe as a consequence of that, understand things that they were especially afraid of or concerned about. And so if you found, for example, that in the 1940s and early 50s, when the Soviet Union lay in rubble, they nevertheless dedicated a huge proportion of their resources to building an elaborate air defense network, you could suppose that maybe air defense was a very high priority for them. And if you understood their fears and concerns, and if you understood on some level how they made decisions in allocating resources, you could, if you were very crafty and very careful, try to influence how those decisions were made and influence them in a way that might work to your advantage over the long haul. Finally, there's Herman Kahn. And again, a different case from the others. Now, Kahn was a mathematical genius and someone of whom I'm sure most of you have heard. He wrote, toward the end of his time at Rand, a popular but controversial book called On Thermonuclear War, and partly as a consequence of writing that book, left to form the Hudson Institution, which continues to thrive to this day, now located in Washington. Kahn was someone who, generally speaking, at least with me, Andy wouldn't bring up unprompted. But when some prompt came up, the things he talked about when he talked about Herman Kahn were, to me at least, especially revealing. Partly that's because although they worked closely together for several years, what Andy talked about was the time they spent outside the office as friends. And along the lines of what Jackie was saying, what Andy was most fond of talking about was the conversations they had, which were not about theory and were not about abstract notions of hundreds of millions of people dying in a war and what that might look like, but real life and the world as it really was, and the kinds of ways that wars might really be fought, and the kinds of irrational decisions that people really make. And the Herman Kahn that he described out of that was a Herman Kahn very different from the popular conception of him, but was someone for whom Andy had clearly felt great love and great affection. So I look back on these three people and their contribution to the legacy that Andy left, and I see at least three things that may come out of that. One was a style of leadership that Andy had that was mostly gentle and persuasive and indirect, by which he encouraged us to think more deeply and more thoroughly and more originally and more grounded in reality than we otherwise would ever have done. And he was an analyst who pioneered wholly new methods of studying the behavior of ourselves and of our adversaries, and who found ways of building on that knowledge to devise very different, very new, very effective kinds of strategies for competing over the long term. And he was someone with dozens, hundreds of very deep friendships, founded partly on work, but more than work, on the conversations about life and the world as it is, and the very irrational things that people do, the good things, the bad things, but the things that make us people rather than theoretical constructs. And these are all wonderful legacies. And I'll just say on a personal note, it's a pleasure for me to see how much the Andy Marshall Foundation is doing to sustain those legacies and to help support the ways that Andy loved this country. And I'm hopeful that this foundation, like other institutions, might begin to play some of the role that Rand played in the 40s and the 50s, and to develop new successive generations of strategists who are able to think and innovate and live in the way that Andy Marshall tried to teach us to do. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And now I turn it over to Matt.
Good afternoon. I am tasked with talking about the future and looking ahead, which is something I enjoy doing. I will say, like Dr. May, I am not necessarily speaking on behalf of the US government or any others. I am speaking only of my own views. So to channel Andrew Marshall's ways for the future, what we're talking about first of all is things like thinking broadly, thinking clearly about our long-term goals, having a cast of mind oriented toward shaping the future rather than simply reacting to it. But there is a heart, or at least a beginning to these things, which is the hard work of seeing the world as it really is in all of its messiness, and doing so sometimes by creating new ways of thinking. So we have the enduring question: how do we equip people to do this? Or at least, where do people who can do this come from? And how do we find them? To see a part of this, at least, it is useful to start with a link between Charles Darwin and Tocqueville, because they illustrate a part of this equation and also a part of Andrew Marshall himself and his work. So if you'll allow me to look back a little bit further, just briefly, to look ahead, I'm going to start with that. The most important event in Charles Darwin's life happened when he was just 22. This was when he set out on the HMS Beagle to sail around the planet, and it was the single most formative event in his life. It happened entirely because of a mentor who opened this opportunity for him from Cambridge, And even after the opportunity was opened, it was almost blocked by his family. His father opposed the trip, and it was an uncle who wrote to Charles Darwin's father that, yes, this would be useless as regards his profession, but if you look on Charles as someone of enlarged curiosity, that it afforded him an opportunity as happens to few. So Darwin boarded the ship. He thought this was going to be a 2-year undertaking. It ended up taking 5 years to circle the planet. And during this time, he wrote about everything he encountered, from first contact events to the island ecologies of the Galapagos and St. Helena. And he began to stack his observations as he went into broad speculations about geology and life. And when he returned and was immersed again in a network of colleagues, he spent 20 years working on the ideas that he had first begun to form and encounter on the Beagle voyage. And of course, this ultimately resulted in a new way of thinking about life itself. Even at the end of Charles Darwin's life, after The Origin of Species was published, Darwin said that the book that he was most proud of was the journal of researches that he wrote in his 20s after the Beagle voyage. So there's actually a good parallel to this in Tocqueville's visit to the United States and his subsequent work. Tocqueville came to the US to study the effects of democracy on a new society, but Tocqueville, like Darwin, set out in his 20s, found he had bitten off a much larger project than he had expected. He wrote observations on nearly everything he encountered, and he found his thinking for the rest of his life shaped by the early experience. Both set out in 1831. Both were distinguished by expansive curiosity and by getting an opportunity to exercise that curiosity in a way that yielded original work. It is hard not to see a version of this arc in the many people, both military officers and civilians, who worked with Andrew Marshall. It is a repeating pattern across decades that people came into his orbit for a period of time, sometimes very long periods of time, and were vitalized and went on to spend careers building on ideas that they had first encountered working with Andrew Marshall or working in net assessment. So there is something to be found here in observing the world and coming up with new ways of thinking and looking at Andrew Marshall's particular ways and approaches in life. The first is interesting life experiences can help produce good thinkers. Andrew Marshall himself wrote about this, but we actually know that this isn't strictly necessary for all thinkers. Some people can sit and read and think and do extraordinary things. Andrew Marshall himself was actually in this category. So perhaps we think of two categories of thinkers, some who need experiences and formative experiences, and others who can kind of sit and read and think. I might put Darwin and Tocqueville in that first category, and perhaps even put Mr. Marshall himself perhaps in the second category. But across these, there is a commonality. All thinkers, it seems, need a network of other people who are tailored to their needs. This could be mentors at the beginning of their life. It could be having students. It could be having colleagues throughout your life, or combinations of these that are suited to the particular individual. After Darwin's Beagle voyage, it was input from his wife that was critical to shaping and focusing the ideas and writings that would go into The Origin of Species. So one of the most noteworthy things about Mr. Marshall was that he not only succeeded in building a network of some of the very best thinkers in the United States, which suited his own thinking and his own work for the United States, but also for a long stretch of his life, the experience of working with Andrew Marshall was for others their odyssey, their version of the interesting life experience or the formative life experience that helped to shape their thinking on long time scales. So how does this guide us for the future? Or how does this offer any guidance to look out ahead of us? I would suggest three relatively simple ideas. All three focus on people rather than, say, teaching particular analytic methods. The first one is encourage somewhat unusual people to be independent thinkers, especially people of enlarged curiosity. New ideas, all new ideas, ultimately come from individuals, not from committees or from departments. And even Isaac Asimov noted the value of people with good intellectual background in their field of interest, but who are also of unconventional habits. This is especially important because bureaucracies and government organizations have a tendency to push out unusual people. So these might be some of the people who might actually be particularly likely to bring new ideas. Second is to mentor others. There are things to learn beyond just particular analytic methods, and these can be especially taught in apprenticeships of many kinds. It is necessary to equip new voices in somewhat unconventional ways relative to our existing institutions and organizations. So for example, that can include teaching the value of skepticism and the value of moral courage and the value of the difficult work of trying to see the world as it is in all its messiness. But it can also involve teaching by example that the good life can center on exercising curiosity and solving hard problems and doing good for our people and our society. So third, and finally, is building new communities around this kind of work. This is this work of seeing the world as it is. This could be new organizations or new institutions or simply convening thinkers over good food and wine. Tocqueville remarked that Americans tend to build organizations of all kinds. This is a part of our civic culture that we should be proud of and that we should exercise here. There is also importance to the future of our own society in this work. History suggests that more successful societies tend to limit the costs of intellectual conformity, tend to maximize the benefits of pluralism and competition, and especially allow for the circulation of new ideas. So in this case, I would especially note that the creation of the Andrew Marshall Foundation is an opportunity to expand this work for a new generation of thinkers.
Thank you, Matt, for the wise counsel and the uplifting look to the future. We are now entering the Q&A phase of the discussion with the speakers, and I see that the questions in the Q&A panel are mounting. So I'm just very quickly going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the panel if anyone wants to weigh in on Mr. Marshall's understanding of bureaucracies and bureaucratic behavior, because one way of thinking about it is, while he was not a model person or a theory person, he was willing to engage with and he experimented with and learned about various theories at various times because he was interested in different ways of getting purchase on reality and the nature of competition. He used bureaucratic models, I think, both to understand blue or our own systems and decision-making, and as a way of understanding red. Would anyone like to weigh in on the contributions that his understanding of the bureaucracy made to his achievement, or anything in the study of bureaucracy that we ought to keep in mind going forward?
It's a difficult question. I'd say for my part, I think it suggests a somewhat limited set of expectations for how radically things can change and how quickly that can happen. Now, obviously, there are periods of extraordinary tumult, but I think one of the things that he became as a consequence of doing that work was much more inclined to think that change was a thing that often happened slowly and often took successive generations, particularly inside the Defense Department, successive generations of officers to take place, and that it changed the way you thought about making recommendations, that there was no good in making recommendations for radical change or for institutions that were incompatible to begin working together, that unfortunately, you needed to take account of a certain body of realities when you began to think about how to move the government in the directions you wanted it to go. But Rich and Matt both saw him in this area closely, so I'm interested in their answers.
I would just add a perspective. I think what Andrew says is quite true. I think in the tradition of Andrew Marshall trying to be clear-eyed about what we're talking about, I would say that Andy Marshall was a thinker in just the ways that Matt has described, but he was not, in my opinion, a particularly skilled bureaucratic actor. He was not somebody who had the ability to amplify his ideas by very astute development of coalitions or relationships with influential congressmen. And as many participants in this call know, his influence waxed and waned according in part to the consumers in a secretary or deputy secretary or other lofty figures, some of them completely ignored or misunderstood Andy. We shouldn't gloss over this, I think, reality. Andy's skills were the skills of somebody who thought clearly and encouraged others to think clearly. And I think he felt that you scattered your seeds out there and you didn't know where they grew up. You couldn't predict that, but it was kind of a the truth shall set ye free orientation to the world. So I think that's a part of the complex of things that responds along with Andrew's very, I thought, apt observations to your question, Jackie.
Thank you.
Could I just ask Andrew, do you disagree with that? Or?
No, I think on being an adroit bureaucratic player, I don't know. I go back and forth on this. I think he was not passive, and actually was, especially the Andy that I see expressed in the documents in the 70s and the 80s, was a much more active player and had a tendency to reach into the person he thought could be the right person at the right time, and that he was much more engaged in that. And compared to the Andy Marshall that I knew much better working for in the late 90s and afterwards, where he had much more of a, people know where I am, and if someone's interested, they can come find me and I'm happy to talk with them, and had a much more they will come to me approach to coaching than he did prior to that, which, at least based on the documents, he seems to have been a bit more active.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we have, I think the first question in the queue is from Mike Nelson at Carnegie Endowment, and he asks a general open-ended one. Which single question or two questions do you think Andy wished that he and his colleagues could have done more to address?
I think the tradition is so well established of deferring to Andrew May on these questions.
Oh, God.
Exactly. I think that's exactly
let me hear something idiotic and you can, yeah. I would say, well, there are some, I'll give one military one and then one non-military one. The military one, I think, at least for me, was the implications of the precision strike revolution, which I believe he felt was not really fully addressed in the 90s. And that in that, and then afterwards, there was a tendency for people to move maybe a little too quickly to new kinds of military technologies, AI, bio, the things that were going to have a huge impact, but that people stopped thinking about the implications for the United States of other militaries getting precision strike capabilities. And so he was concerned that that question had not received the attention that it deserves. The other was a question he posed to me one time, and I know to Barry, and I believe to other people over the course of time, which was why the West seems to have risen relative to the rest of the world beginning around the mid-16th century. And I think he did it partly because he felt it wasn't adequately well understood, But he also did it because the literature on that question is so interesting and the problem is so rich and compelling that it was a educational assignment, at least for me. When he gave it to me, it was, you need to learn about this and you need to learn how to think about these kinds of questions. So please go learn about that and come back and tell me when you're done. And I told him what I'd learned, but I don't think I educated him one iota. It was a thing he thought people should study because of the way of thinking that it could inculcate.
I would only add, I got both of those topics secondhand, a little bit from Mr. Marshall and a lot from Andrew May, and have followed picking up Kennedy and Mocher and other books to think about these questions of why the West emerged and how we might think about that, and also a lot on the value of information in modern military competitions and how that fits into other emerging militaries beginning to be able to do precision strike, and what that means for kind of future military competitions.
In a way, that's perfect, because the next question is there a historical period or topic that Mr. Marshall was particularly fond of or believed was particularly instructive, or perhaps mentioned, but didn't have the time to explore in great depth? So we already have at least one period or two on the docket. I know Mr. Marshall sponsored research studies, case studies of successful strategies that were deployed in different times and places in the past. So from what I could tell, he was open to different periods that could be instructive. I put that question to the panel.
The other period that I at least would nominate is one that he became interested in maybe the last 5 or 10 years that he talked to me about it, which was the late 19th and early 20th century, which, as I'm sure he mentioned to you too, Jackie, and everyone on the panel, he began to think was maybe an appropriate time to think of as a parallel to today, that so many of the innovations that the military was trying to react to were coming out of the civil and commercial society, the internal combustion engine, telegraphy, other kinds of things. And the military struggled, and militaries in most countries failed to figure out how to exploit those new technologies in militarily efficacious ways, and conducted themselves in ways that looked like criminal negligence in hindsight. And his suspicion was perhaps things like the internet and other types of revolutions that we're going through today are similarly going to be poorly understood by the militaries around the world. And we may face a, unfortunately, similarly painful series of conflicts before we begin to understand them appropriately.
Yeah, I think that's a particularly important point. The tendency frequently now is to talk about technology in terms of research and development, and how much is our lead, and where are we, and what are we investing in, what are the Chinese doing. And for Andy, it all went through some sort of focusing crystal or magnifying glass, so that it came out to, what does this actually mean operationally? And that's just hugely important, so that now I think people think they can register that they're assimilating modern technologies when they're spending more money on it. And that kind of thing was not Andy. Indeed, one of the things that characterized, I thought, in that assessment, the way Andy ran the office, was that when so much of the building was driven by budgets, he was thinking much more strategically and conceptually.
I would only add to this that when I first started engaging with net assessment, I didn't know what period it was interested in, because I was handed documents on so many different time periods. Some centuries past, some decades past, some decades in the future, that it was very hard to tell, at least initially.
The difference between you, Matt, and Andrew and Jackie and me, especially Andrew and me, is that you think that what happened in 2010 is ancient history.
Not to go any further down that road, I think I'm going to just offer a set of questions, a menu, and you guys can choose. And I also should have mentioned that that last question on historical periods was from Peter Carritzos of IDA. So there are a lot of questions, so I'm just going to give you guys some options in our remaining time. One is from Phil Cornell. Was Mr. Marshall's use of war games more powerful than his relationship with the Secretary of Defense or the rest of the Department of Defense? Another is from Abe Shulsky. What would a RAND for our days and the future look like? Would it be possible to construct such an institution today? Would it need a funding source other than the US government? Could it be sufficiently isolated from day-to-day politics? And from Peter Schwartz, finally, Andy was very concerned about the long-term strategic competition with China. Indeed, he supported a lot of my work on the issue. If he were here today, how would he see how it is evolving?
I choose Matt to go first. I think
I'm gonna
you agree with me.
I'm going to go for the low-hanging fruit then, which is a new RAND. I would create, and I'm horrifically biased in this, a organization to think about long-term space activities and especially military space competition. I think we are ripe for a organization that could help American leaders make wise decisions for long-term space competition, be able to work as closely with defense leaders as RAND was able to in the 1950s, but also have the time to actually think about long-term trends and many issues.
I'll take on the RAND point, also recognizing that I'm a RAND trustee, and here I need the disclaimer that I'm obviously not speaking in that role. One thing that's very striking to me is that RAND obviously had its origins in the competition with the Soviet Union, and carried the momentum of the World War II analytic effort, but for decades it was built around that theme. The competition with China is probably as fundamental and likely to be long enduring, but we haven't built a think tank that has that central focus and critical mass in the scores of people. There are places that do a good job. One of them is CSET on the subject of AI in China. One of them is CNA, for example, Center for Naval Analyses. But RAND in particular, and RAND-like organizations in general, it seems to me, need to fill that role more vibrantly, not with a dozen analysts, but scores of analysts that build up muscular understanding more broadly. And it brings me to a broader point, which I'd conclude with, but it's an observation about Andy as well, which is an aspect of all of this that tends to elude the day-to-day analytic activity that interested Andy a great deal, is the cultural perception of the world. And this comes out in Jackie's nice anecdote about school kids and the way they envision the route from home to school. But it's in things like Nathan Leitus's work at RAND on Kremlin moods, which Andrew will attest, I'm sure, was a factor in Andy's thinking. How do we think about the world? And in what ways is it different from ways Chinese thinkers think about the world? That's a subject that you, Jackie, have worked a fair amount on and may want to comment on. I think it's remarkably rich and subtle, and we have some insight about it, but I'd like to have a whole lot more. And I would just add, with respect to Andy, that there's another aspect to Andy, which was his foreign relationships, and particularly with the Israelis. I had the privilege of going with him once to Israel, where if I began by saying he was loved by us, boy, he was adored there. And he saw the world in part through their lenses as well, and that broadened and amplified his view. I have to tell you, though, just in final conclusion, that to me, one of the most surprising conversations I ever had with Andy was in the weeks before he died, when I realized for the first time that he had never been to the Soviet Union or to China. And when I prodded him a bit on that, asking him if he'd wanted to and the like. He said some things about he knew too much, classification and so on, but I really felt that he didn't want to go. And this casts a little light, I think, on your anecdotes in the beginning, excellent, Matt, about de Tocqueville and Darwin. Andy, by and large, thought in collaboration with other people more than in traveling in the world. But he was extremely interested in how all of us thought and how we were different from one another. In my example, the US and China. So I just want to underscore these points in conclusion.
It's hard to add a whole lot to that, those two sets of comments. The one thing I might say is this question of a future RAND is something I talked about with Andy several times over the course of the years. And one other thing he mentioned to me, in addition to the things that Matt and Rich just talked about, was the, I guess, kind of contingent nature of the way things happened to come together at RAND. There was a lot of right time, right place, right people, things here and there. And in his view, and those who know him know this was something he practiced in life, it would probably be a good idea to start a few. That a lot of things don't bloom the way you'd hope. And it's very hard to know the outset what's going to work and what's not. And so I like to think that what he would advocate for was trying many new institutions. None of them are going to have the monopolistic potency maybe that RAND had in the 1940s and the 1950s. But as Matt and Rich suggested, the array of questions is so great and the stakes are so high that it might be worth trying several such institutions with slightly different areas of focus and hoping that some of them over the course of time pan out.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we're running short on time, so I'm going to pass the baton to Jamie for some closing thoughts, but thank you all for the questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, and I think that there's definitely material for another session. I put that to the foundation, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I mean, it's terrific. Jackie, you did a terrific job, but Richard and Matt and Andrew, I mean, it just couldn't have had it better. The questions, unfortunately, as I look at them in the Q&A, are just fabulous, and hopefully we can figure out how to get some answers or at least do things with them. I mean, you know, as part of the foundation, obviously, we might take a look at them and come back to you and say, hey, how would you flesh this out? But thank you very much. You know, I want to close real quick with one of the points made, or actually two of the points made in the Q&A, but one deals with what Matt talked about with Darwin's father and his approach. And I want to just say that Andy could never have been Darwin's father. He would have never, in my view, said no to him. He encouraged curiosity. I mean, he was, you know, I mean, the more curious you were, the happier he seemed to be, but he wasn't very happy if your curiosity didn't have at least some focus to it. And he made you do your homework. And so perhaps, as Ben Chang asked in the room about whether Andy's approach to people was more maternal than paternal. And so maybe we ought to ask Matt to go back and look at Darwin's mother to see what her view on him is. But it's a great question. And I do want to close with something that Graham Allison points out, which is that Andy had this omnivorous intellectual curiosity. He read from Max Weber to Herb Simon to Jim March to Lionel Tiger to Sid Winter, you name it. I mean, Richard Danzig, Andrew May. I mean, I know people don't really read other people's dissertations, but he read Andrew's dissertation. And he read, you know, so much more. And when he read things, as we all know, and those of you who knew him, and where he found value, he engaged people. He called you and said, hey, come see me, or had Andrew call you, or Dimitri call you and say, hey, you know, let's talk about this. And he was always willing to give people a shot to try to flesh things out. So I think all of us, all the folks on this call, everybody else should think about that and continue to do that. And, you know, as Andrew said, you know, about finding the next Andy Marshall or fully grown, I look at it, I'm not quite sure that there will ever be Andy was insistent there will never be another Andy Marshall, but he was also insistent that people could be and would be smarter than him. So that's the new voices we're looking for. And again, thank you everybody that's on in the listening to this. Matt, Richard, Stephanie, Jackie, thank you. It's all terrific. And we will have this posted up on our website sometime in the next couple of days, and look forward to hearing from everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie.